Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will.
Yeah, right.
I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. NFL Divisional Weekend. 7 meaningful football games remain on the schedule before we will know who the 2023-2024 Super Bowl champion is and will be. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. Payne, hopefully you're doing well this fine Thursday, my friend.
Yeah, no complaints. Here we are, 7 games left.
It is a war of attrition this time of year. Just ask some of these rosters that'll go to battle this weekend. Some of them on short rest, some of them down key starters. We will, of course, cover all 4 of these games in great detail. Payne, it must be good, though, to be a Dallas Cowboys head coach. You go out there, lay an egg on a big stage, and you get the dreaded vote of confidence from your owner, Mike McCarthy, back to man the sidelines for Dallas in 2024.
I think the initial instinct is to fire him because he's not going to be able to lead you to the promised land. In saying that, once you take a step back and give yourself a deep breath, who's replacing him?
Jason Garrett, bring him back for a second stint. Get Jimmy Johnson out of the Fox pregame show. Now he's the Ring of Honor. See what he's still got left in the tank.
He did deliver quite the halftime speech there.
That was impassioned. I thought he was going to break down there in tears.
Did.
And looking at Strahan's face made it all the more entertaining because Strahan had to bite his lip to keep from laughing.
Yeah.
You bring that kind of fire into the locker room. Maybe that's what Dak and the boys need to not just be paper tigers during the regular season, but to find a way into the NFC Championship. But you're right.
The list of candidates is who are you hiring? Like everyone's like, interview Belichick and Harbaugh. Like those guys are going to want control. Jerry Jones ain't giving up control. So, he busted out. That was a horrific performance on his own this year for the Chargers. Right?
Yeah,
there's not much out there. And so this will sound crazy to some because McCarthy's the butt of jokes. Many come from us. But I would almost feel more comfortable bringing McCarthy back than I would Sirianni. And I know...
Interesting.
A lot of people will be like, the guy took him to the Super Bowl last year. I think this day and age, you got to be willing to fire fast. Last year was very much predicated on schedule being as soft as humanly possible, playing from great game states, and it's very evident now the brains left town. You kind of knew it offensively because once Shane Steichen took over in year 1, the offense just took off. So it doesn't shock me that once he left town, the offense sputtered all season. Defensively, we knew there were going to be issues. Maybe not issues, but they were not going to be nearly as good as last season just based upon the schedule, based upon some of the guys they had leaving. Jonathan Gannon, we respect as a defensive mind. TBD on a head coach. But clearly a massive upgrade over Matthew Patricia. We know Sirianni has a massive ego, right? The little expose he put on walking into the Chiefs tunnel.
Yeah, would they go 1-5 down the stretch after he decided he wanted to run his mouth there?
Forget if they go 1-5. You lost a fucking Super Bowl and you're celebrating a win on a fucking Thursday. Like, I mean, yay! it's like congratulations. You won like the smallest sector of the war, and you're gonna get absolutely trounced otherwise. It makes no sense. Just a lack of self-awareness, but also the ego. I mean, Sean Desai was effectively relieved of his duties after a gauntlet schedule. Like, there wasn't some internal thought process of like, oh my God, we've just faced a slew of great teams that maybe the defense is a little worn out. We just played 95 snaps in one game. And so he doesn't show well, and the thought is like we're going to bring in Matt Patricia. I mean, how many times do we need to see Matt Patricia? Ain't that guy?
I mean,
and
Patricia
so
continues to get more opportunity and more jobs. So
right before the biggest game of the season, you don't even make the switch back. You can't be like, man, I think I was wrong here. We were more effective with Sean. We're going to go back that way. He's certainly still on the staff. No. Ego wouldn't allow it. And of all the teams that played last week, it's very obvious. And, you got Troy Aikman in the booth there. Guy won't say anything even remotely questionable. He must have said in 4 different iterations that the Eagles quit. No, they just fucking quit. I mean, you just come out and say it, Troy. We all see it.
It's tough for Troy with his Dallas Cowboys roots to
none of the other
out.
wild card losers quit. They may have lost. They didn't quit. And so now you have a head coach who, and we've had this conversation before, was like the 8th choice when he was hired. Kid you not, they were looking at Josh McDaniel at one point before this guy. And so you have all of these data points where it's like, Sirianni was like our 8th guy. Sirianni's offense sucks at any point that Shane Steichen hasn't been involved, right? You have a guy who is willing to promote Matt Patricia of all freaking people. It was the one team whose team quit on him. So, I mean, yes, to me, 2 and done. I would have relieved myself of that, but apparently they're all coming together and trying to find coordinators because both will be replaced, and I think that's going to be more difficult than people think. We'll see.
It's always interesting when you look at the landscape in the NFC East. Washington hasn't named a head coach, but you can make the case that they might have the most stability at the head coaching position without actually having a head coach on their roster right now. Cowboys, Eagles, maintaining the status quo, and we've seen some of the stories coming out of New York about the potential changes that'll come at the coordinator position under Brian Daboll. But into the games themselves, Payne, and we'll start things off Saturday afternoon, 4:30 Eastern from Baltimore. The Ravens, fresh off a bye they earned as the number 1 seed in the AFC, nearly a double-digit favorite as they'll welcome in C.J. Stroud and the Houston Texans. Officially, Baltimore, a 9.5-point chalk total on the game, 43.5 down from the open. These teams met all the way back in week 1 in C.J. Stroud's NFL debut. He went 28 for 44, 242 yards, sacked 5 times. It was Lamar Jackson's first time leading the Todd Monken offense. It looked wonky, it looked clunky, but it did not stop the Baltimore Ravens from getting outside the numbers and Zay Flowers splashing on the big stage. When we look at what's at stake this weekend, the Houston Texans can advance to their first conference title game in franchise history. They can become the 6th team ever to defeat the number 1 scoring defense Ravens and the number 1 total defense Browns in different games in a single postseason, and they can surpass the 1999 Rams, who went off at 150-1, and the 2021 Bengals at 150-1 for the longest preseason title odds for a team to make a conference championship over the last 45 seasons. Meanwhile, on the other side, we know the narratives. Lamar Jackson still looking for that first elusive playoff victory. The Ravens will be the 4th team since 1970 with a first-team All-Pro quarterback and the number 1 scoring defense. All 3 went on to ultimately win the Super Bowl. This is a team that when you look at how they've played at home, especially when they step up in class, has exceeded everyone's expectations. We've used them quite frequently as a best bet in that particular spot. The one thing when we look at Lamar in terms of his ability to cover numbers as a 3.5 or higher favorite has not been a role extremely kind to him. Just 6-16 against the spread in 22 operations in that particular role. But Payne, when we try and find an angle or a matchup worth looking at in this spot, Bobby Slowick and company put on a masterclass attacking the Cleveland Browns defense last week using the over pursuit. This Ravens defense a little bit more buttoned up in that particular regard. Against C.J. Stroud, who's even more limited at the receiver position than he was even a week ago. C.J. Stroud is all the rage, Payne. I can't imagine that'll be lost on Coach McDonald and the Baltimore Ravens defense with a chance to go out there and make a statement at home. Yeah.
I mean, fun game. I think so. My mind wants to go so many places with this. It almost wants to go backwards. Like last week's wild card round to me was one of the worst we've had in a long time. I mean, the games were non-competitive aside from the Detroit game, and many of those final scores probably weren't even indicative of what actually transpired on the field. And the market in and of itself is completely wonky now where sports books are taking advantage of those willing to take lower limits, and they're putting lines out 5-6 hours before they actually hit the screen, and getting those molded, and it led to some weirdness and difficulties, and I think giving out some things on this show and in general. This week, to me, it's supposed to be the great week, divisional round. And here we are discussing these games. We got 2 near double-digit games. We got a near touchdown game, and then we have the watered-down version of Chiefs-Bills for a 7th time in 4 years. And so these games are pretty interesting. But, kind of merging last week to this week, I think when we spoke about Houston, it was the price being ridiculous last week and how it was the same number with Case Keenum starting 3 weeks ago against Cleveland, but we felt the matchup favored the Browns. But what unfolded, to your initial point, was both the ridiculous price and Bobby Slowick knowing his man. And I think as great as the Browns defense was this season, there were so many instances that left you scratching your head, whether it was a specific drive or two in a high leverage moment, constantly where it's like, as I watched the Browns, like, hey, this is about to be a turning point in the game. Let's get that momentum stop. Couldn't. Off the top of my head, it's the late game Seattle drive. There were certain games or drives where it was just, man, they couldn't get the high leverage stop. And it honestly wasn't until Tuesday. I went back and I just remember conversations I had with people about Jim Schwartz years ago, and I dug up some old articles about Jim Schwartz being fired in both Detroit and Philadelphia, and so there's so many articles that go back discussing how predictable Jim Schwartz is, right? How his principles never change, and players don't have the ability to change their role down to down. I truly think Bobby Slowick knew everything that was coming the second time in 3 weeks. Isolation shots against some single high looks. He's building, in alert screens we saw with the touchdown pass to Nico there. I think as Eagles fans know, that 2019 season, my God, like the Eagles allowed more than, 100-yard receivers, more 30-yard passing touchdowns than anybody in the league. And I just immediately started seeing how that unfolded last week. The execution was fantastic as well. I look at the Texans' offensive line. They're fully healthy, helped keep C.J. Stroud upright. But, man, that dude right now is just fantastic navigating the pocket. He's always moving around. He's trying to hunt downfield rather than take off. He's just been the ultimate point guard and facilitator, especially at home in the Dome. He does have some drastic road splits, but we do have another rematch here. And I actually think it helps the Ravens defense a little bit, being able to see what transpired last week. We know Mike McDonald has been very adaptable. He's seen C.J. Stroud multiple times in both college, and now the NFL. They played in week 1, and certainly C.J. Stroud's a different quarterback than he was in week 1. But Mike McDonald does a fantastic job mixing his coverages, and I think a game like this is the reason McDonald's in Baltimore and Wink isn't. Right? Mike McDonald, if you look in the 2 games at home in weather, used more man coverage than any other games this season. 2 of his 3 highest blitz games Mike McDonald called in home and weather. There was anticipation of weather in this game. At one point, it was 18-mile-per-hour steady winds. It was gusts, getting to 35 miles per hour. It's a little bit more tame as we're recording this here, Thursday morning. But it's the reason you saw, openers as high as 47 and shit, even a few places peaked to 48 once it finally hit the screen, and times and days were announced. It opened to consensus 46. We're down through the key of 44 to 43 and a half. It becomes interesting if that weather continues to subside now that we're on the opposite side of that crucial key. But I don't think you ever want to downplay a Shanahan disciple, and CJ Stroud again is on absolute fire right now. But go back to our 49ers breakdown a couple weeks ago. You remember that game, Todd?
Which 49ers game are you talking about? The one against the Baltimore Ravens?
Yep. And we kind of talked about Mike McDonald's usage of light boxes. And McDonald kind of welcomes you to run to a certain extent, and he plays more guys in coverage because he believes guys like Michael Pierce and Roquan Smith up the middle can stymie the run game, and he's got Clowney, who's been one of the league's best edge setters for years, and Owe has actually set the edge real well this season as well. So I think the Texans are going to look pre-snap and be presented with what appears to be good run looks. We know Slowick comes from that Shanahan tree. It's in his DNA to want to run. So the first question I think becomes is Houston's ground game efficient enough to take advantage? And I have questions about that. 25th in run block win rate, 21st in adjusted line yards created. The construction of the Texans O-line better as pass blockers than Maulers. And Singletary hasn't been efficient when it comes to EPA or success rate. He does hit some explosives. Dameon Pierce, we know, has been phased out. He's not really a zone scheme fit for Slowick's offense. But I think the Texans have to somehow be balanced here based on the light boxes they'll see, the potential for wind. And if you look at the Texans' run scheme, their most used run play is inside zone. And while they're, merely average-ish in efficiency, the Ravens have been bottom 8 in the league in EPA defending that specific run type. So they're going to have to be able to be efficient running it here. If you can get that aspect of the offense going to where Baltimore has to respect it a little bit more, that would be huge for the throw game. As you mentioned, Noah Brown going to be out back on IR. But I think Slowick needs to have CJ throwing with play action against the Ravens defense, because if you want to throw on them straight, it's difficult, right? Number one in EPA allowed per dropback. If you toss in a play action element ahead of the pass against the Ravens, they dip to a below average defense defending the pass. So, this is certainly going to be a little bit more of an uphill battle here for Houston's offense when you just think potential for win. Guys, again, and the receiver core banged up a little bit. The way it's not is if Houston's able to get their ground game going a little bit, as old school as that sounds.
It's interesting. I mean, you put some numbers to that, more counting stats than anything else. Rookie quarterbacks have typically struggled playing on the road at Baltimore under Coach Harbaugh. Just 2-17 from a straight-up standpoint, 13.3 points per game, completion percentage below 55, a touchdown-interception ratio of 10-24, and a passer rating sub-65. Now, C.J. Stroud, not necessarily cut from that same cloth, but you'd have enough of a sample size to know that they're going to be up against it, and we'll see how far C.J. has come from what we saw in that season opener and his NFL debut. On the other side,
I think
Payne,
the time off too really helps with some of those injuries that Baltimore had on defense coming into the.
Oh, you have to hope that Marlon Humphrey and company are significantly healthier, along with some of their other pass rushers and stuff, to be able to get out there and also come up with some unique exotic looks to try and confuse a young quarterback in this spot. On the other side, for the Ravens, Payne, the big storyline to follow was Mark Andrews, listed as a full participant in practice on Wednesday. Coach Harbaugh was optimistic on Tuesday, saying he thought it was his best showing so far. So the rich get richer in that regard. When we look at this Ravens offense, we know they want to establish the ground game, but a much more dynamic throw game to boot with healthy receivers and Zay Flowers, Odell Beckham Jr., and all of the cast that should be able to attack a Houston secondary that's been vulnerable to the big play and kind of been their Achilles heel all season. The strength of that defense has been against the run, but the Ravens, they're not intimidated running into loaded boxes and should have a path to success, especially if Houston has to sell out to stop the run. It'll open up some man opportunities on the outside. Ravens offense, we know the storylines about Lamar trying to get that monkey off his back, but Todd Monken offense going to look a heck of a lot different than the last couple times we've seen Lamar in the postseason running Greg Roman sets.
Yeah, I think there's probably some variance on this side. Baltimore has been, I wouldn't say scrutinized, but certainly there's been some comments about electing to rest guys in week 18, knowing they had the bye week, and they'll be out of game action for about 21 days. And I'll be honest, I was told not to worry about that, because one thing Harbaugh took away from that 2019 loss to the Titans was needing a far tighter practice schedule, more intense practices throughout this 3 weeks, more intensity leading up. And I've been told the practices have been pretty intense. And I think where the variance lies here is the Ravens offense has certainly evolved exponentially since that week 1 matchup. I know everyone we'll talk about, how CJ Stroud's different and, certainly. But I think this offense for Baltimore is drastically different as well when you think about Todd Monk and Lamar Jackson, that marriage, that being their first go-round together, so to speak. But the Texans, aside from like a few random games, have been very good stopping the run. I think we mentioned that last week. In totality, number 2 in run stop win rate, number 2 in defensive rush efficiency. However, the style of which the Ravens run, its power, its man, inside concepts, those have been the best places to attack the Texans when you want to run on them. The outside zone runs, forget about it. Like, those have not worked at all against Houston. But inside is where the Texans have been their worst defending the run. So I do think the Texans front has a tougher, more rested unit in front of them. You go back to last week against Cleveland, and this is maybe something we probably didn't factor in enough because Stefanski had been a magician working around it. But that Browns offensive line, my goodness, we knew both tackles were out, right and left. That had been for a large portion of the season, right? You think it's factored into the number. Stefanski's been able to kind of scheme around it a little bit. The problem was the left guard, Joe Boltonio, left with an injury. And then at one point, a guy projected to be the 6th man in the tackle rotation got snaps due to a backup being injured. So Cleveland's offensive line was in shambles. And my point here is, like, I think you're getting a well-rested, more physical, better offensive line in the Ravens. Will Anderson looked much healthier. We did see Jonathan Grenard only played 15 snaps, came off the field, slammed his helmet, never returned. I think you probably want to watch that one closely. In theory, this would be a spot where the Ravens are facing an opponent, to your point, Todd, that stops the run well. This is the reason Todd Monken came to town, to open up that pass game. Again, you'll have to think about the weather here because that could provide a layer of variance. But in theory, like, Isaiah Likely should show well here. Mark Andrews, if he's fully available in his normal self, should show well here. The Texans I think we made a point of them struggling to defend tight ends, and once again, that was the case. Njoku cleared all of his prop numbers, whether it was receptions, yards, longest, you name it. So the Texans just have a real problem defending tight ends. Teams love to attack the middle of the field. I think Lamar also feels very comfortable when teams do not blitz him, and the Texans are not a high blitz team, as we know, right? DeMeco Ryans wasn't that in San Francisco. He hasn't been that for Houston, and so I think Lamar has a little bit more time than certainly Joe Flacco had. If wind is a factor, and again, it's trending substantially lower than what it was initially in the week. Tight ends, a guy like Zay Flowers, who's electric after the catch. I know we've bemoaned the fact that they're not getting Zay Flowers the ball more downfield, but in this spot, again, if there is wind, he can make guys miss on those short throws as an extension of the ground game. Zay ranks 4th among qualifying receivers in missed tackles forced per catch. The Texans have graded out 26th in tackling in totality, have been credited with missing 130 tackles this season, one less than the most of any team in the league. So I think there's
I think the Eagles missed
here.
130 tackles just last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Payne, I'm not going to lie.
Is it credited a missed tackle if you quit and don't actually attempt to try to touch the offensive player?
Nope. It's the same old argument I have. Same old argument I have with people in baseball. You don't get credited with an error if you take a bad path to the ball and never get anywhere close to trying to track it down in the outfield.
There you go. Boy, I mean, they made that trade for Bayer, who's been like a consummate professional, one of the best safeties, and he was out there just making business decisions.
He looked like he was stuck in concrete by design.
So that's kind of my vibe here. Like, so initially, there's supposed to be some heavy wins. That's why we've seen some under money. Also, somewhat pertaining to the Texans' offense looking vastly different than what they looked last week in the comfy confines of a dome with no elements, with CJ Stroud at home. And I think the Texans are going to have to be able to run the ball here to find, whatever their version of peak offensive success is with basically, Nico Collins and Schultz and Brevin Jordan. They're certainly undermanned when it comes to weapons with Noah Brown and Tank Dell out. And this just becomes a very tough matchup. I will say, I think we've made mentions of this for months now. There are there's a particular group that certainly has a hard-on for the Texans. And so, where does this go from here? I'm not sure. A couple places flash 10. It doesn't seem to hold. And I know all of like the fantasy bros and, the fans are loving CJ Stroud, and they should, because he is just an absolute talent. But I mean,
I think there's a lot of public money out there.
The number feels a little short, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of public money out there in this game that's going to keep it below the 10, but if the next move is to 10 and there's minimal resistance, it tells us that we may be in store for yet another blowout in a continuing trend so far this NFL postseason.
CJ Stroud goes ham and maybe, he becomes that dude if he does that. My number here is certainly on the other side of 10. I'm not usually ingrained in laying these types of numbers.
Well, it's funny that you mention it, because we get in a near another double-digit favorite to break down in short order, because when we travel from the East Coast out to the West Coast for the game in primetime on Saturday night, we'll have the San Francisco 49ers fresh off of their bye, laying nearly a double-digit tariff, 9.5-point chalk across the board. Total in this game, 50.5 for the most part. There are a couple of 50s on the low end and 51s out there. This has become the most common playoff matchup. 10 previous meetings in NFL playoff history, with the 49ers leading this all-time series 5-4. High level of coaching familiarity between Matt LaFleur on the Green Bay side and Kyle Shanahan for the 49ers. Worked on the same staff starting back in 2008-2009. Spent time in Washington, Atlanta, everywhere else along the way. And when we look at what Shanahan has done, he's beaten LaFleur by a combined score of 50-30, including a 13-10 outright win as a 7-point dog with Jimmy Garoppolo, and a commanding 37-20 win in the NFC Championship a handful of years ago. Green Bay, we can shower them with praise. They became the youngest team to win a playoff game since the 1970 merger, with an average age of 25 years, 214 days. You talk about CJ Stroud being that dude. Jordan Love looked the part when called upon last week against the Cowboys, but clearly Green Bay aided by short fields, a defensive score, and playing from a positive game script, but that shouldn't detract from how well Jordan Love has played to even get them to this point. Meanwhile, the 49ers, this is a group 18-1 from a straight-up standpoint, averaging more than 32 points per game, with a plus 16 points per game differential when they have a healthy Brock Purdy, Christian McCaffrey, and Deebo Samuel, including the playoffs, the lone blemish, the game that you referenced on Christmas where they lost outright as a 5.5, 6-point favorite to the Baltimore Ravens. Green Bay, very good as an underdog. The Packers have gone over the total in 6 straight road games. But Payne, this is a different animal they're going to face. And while Jordan Love may be leading an offense with the second best EPA since week 9, in steps a 49ers team that if they get healthy along that defensive line could pose some challenges. All signs point to Eric Armstead returning after a 5-game absence.
Yeah, they're going to absolutely be healthier along the defensive line. Maybe a rotational piece in Clelin Ferrell. Blast from the past there for those who...
What a great pick for the Raiders, top 5 overall. What a great pick.
So I do envision the 49ers being healthier there. This is very tough for me because... I believe in the improvements of the Packers, and we believed that the offense would look more like it did down the stretch than it did the first half of the season because we played their win total over. And I like what LaFleur has been doing, much more aggressive. There were some conversations that were had, call it post-Rams game, where he was doing some things that were not overly efficient that he was certainly alerted to, and since then has changed his ways, and it's led to a far more efficient offense. And I like LaFleur being really aggressive last week, took the ball early, probably will do it again if he can here. When Jordan Love was throwing, he was attacking downfield against Dallas, and that was something we mentioned last week, attack the attacker, 11.3-yard ADOT. It was more the early season style where Green Bay was pushing it downfield because they knew they weren't finding the down-to-down success, so they needed to be explosive. But it was kind of a mix of both where you got the downfield throws, the aggressiveness, but at the same time you had a more on-time, in-rhythm, confident Jordan Love executing it. And so for me, this seems very straightforward for an attack plan this week. I think the Packers will want to be aggressive, take the ball first. LaFleur will want to keep this game in a neutral state so his ground game can remain present throughout. The loss of A.J. Dillon has been addition by subtraction because it's allowed a healthy Aaron Jones to kind of shoulder the workload. And right now it feels like LaFleur has finally embraced that situation for as much as he's fought it over the last few seasons.
And he has fought it. He has fought it more than anybody else. But what's funny about it, Payne, Packers fans claim it was by design because Aaron Jones wasn't healthy enough to maintain a full workload, which I call bullshit on every time I watch this team operate. Yeah, well, I mean, 4 years is a long time, but look, we're seeing it pay the dividends of Aaron Jones' ability as a runner and a receiver that you've been clamoring for about 3 seasons on this show.
Now, I think if you're going to use A.J. Dillon as like a change of pace back, sure. I mean, if he's shouldering, 55% of the work, like there's a problem there. And I get that Aaron Jones probably isn't a guy you can, give 25 touches to a week and have him play an entire season. So you do need that compliment. But I always felt like the roles should be reversed and it should be like a 65-35 type of split there, and just never was that. But kind of getting back on track here, it's like, if you watch, the Packers have increased their rate of outside zone runs down the stretch with a quicker, faster Aaron Jones as opposed to a Plotter and Dillon. 47% outside zone the last 3 games against the Cowboys. 64%. So LaFleur is just spamming outside zone runs, and just for context, league average about 26%. I mention that because since week 10, and I always try to keep things fair, incorporating both Chase Young into the fold and all of the defensive adjustments post-bye the 49ers implemented where, they were moving Steve Wilks back down to the field, and Kyle Shanahan was integrating himself in defensive meetings and changing his entire schedule post that Vikings game, and they were making some switches with personnel in the secondary. Factor all of that in. The 49ers, since week 10, with all of those adjustments, dead last in EPA per rush and success rate allowed against outside zone runs. So that is why this game needs to be in a neutral state for the Packers. What's interesting to me is I think if you get that, you'll notice, right, as theoretically aggressive as the play calls are, game state wise, I mean, Packers are draining that freaking clock down every single time, it seems, to 1 second, 2 seconds, sometimes, 0 Mississippi. It's going to be interesting to see what the throw game looks like. You certainly have the full complement of pass catchers back. Wick's return. You got whatever Watson could give you. Jaden Reed a little bit healthier. But I think we discussed how the Cowboys defense had been trending down the stretch, how horrific the linebackers were, the secondary vastly overrated, and not to be fooled by, Deron Bland's flash interceptions. And we kind of understood how hurt, Stephon Gilmore was. And what do you see? 12 hours after the game, he's going in for surgery. So I don't necessarily know what to take from that. And I thought Dan Quinn certainly had one of his worst schemes. The one element that is present this week, right? Like the Packers' offensive line held up extremely well against the Cowboys' front. We kind of mentioned if that was like a stalemate, the Packers would have offensive success. They came into that game second pass block win rate. They held the Cowboys to a 33% pressure rate, substantially below their season-long average, especially in that building. So they're going to need to do the same against the 49ers D-line. But I think part of the adjustments, aside from like Shanahan being more present in the meeting rooms defensively, is during that shift, they moved Oliver out of the cornerback rotation, the 49ers did. They moved Lenore into the slot. They made Aubrey Thomas the starter outside. And since that time, the 49ers are third in yards per pass attempt allowed against 3 wide receiver sets. The first week, the first 9 weeks, the 49ers were 26th in that regard. And why I'm bringing this up is like, you will have seen and heard probably by the time this game kicks off all of the heavy formation that the Packers used, and they stayed in that because Dan Quinn was basically playing too high shell the entire game and not bringing more guys down in the box because he just knew his secondary and linebackers were horrific. And you can't do that against the 49ers. They've been very stout against heavy personnel. So I think you're going to see more 3-wide sets here. And, the 49ers against the pass have been very good defending that. Still horrific defending outside zone runs from the 3-wide set. So I don't necessarily think, even though the 49ers defense is certainly beatable, and I think we've talked about that from, the season preview of how the rotation along the defensive line isn't as robust. We're not seeing like the five-man, 4-man hockey front rotations that we had seen in prior years of that 49ers defensive line. The secondary, specifically at safety, not as good. The depth in the secondary, not as good. And so you've seen games where it's like, okay, that's not quite the 49ers defense. I think, they've downgraded in defensive mind from, D'Amico Ryans to Wilkes. So this isn't like a picture perfect 49ers defense that's, impenetrable. But this is going to look vastly different than what we saw last week. And I think, when you see that big score, and we talked off air about this, very synthetic, and that some third down conversions early for the Packers to score on some of those drives. You get the 14 points and defensive scores. You then look at the game state, and it's a 7-point favorite having to chase 27 points, and it's just going to erupt at that point. And so, I don't think the Packers have as much success. And even down the stretch, you think about some of those defenses that the Packers played, right? It's the Giants defense, it's Carolina's defense, it's believe was Washington's defense in the mix there? Or am I thinking about the 49ers? I'm thinking about the 49ers.
That was the 49ers played the Commanders.
But I guess where I'm going with this is
you had the Bucks. You had the Bucks defense mixed in there
secondary.
as well.
Yeah, and that was much earlier, I believe, when they were decimated by injury. Something we'll talk about here shortly. But where I'm going is like the one like really like solid defense that they played. They're at home and we're still only able to like hang 17. And I understand there were some missed opportunities there. Not being able to capitalize on drives, scoring 7 instead of 3, right? The kerfluffle there before halftime of Jordan Love throwing the ball short and not getting out of bounds, and so that was an easy 3 that wasn't put on the board. But the one defense, right, that was playing well, that was in somewhat of the same class of the 49ers was Chicago, and the Packers mustered 17 points at home. So I think that's interesting. Like we love, Jordan Love. But I think if you're expecting, performances like last week, you're probably going to be off here.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the defense, and of course, Green Bay has trended up in that particular fashion, prompting Matt LaFleur to say, I couldn't be happier when speaking on the defense's recent performances. I know that Joe Barry is all about, and I couldn't be happier, just the resiliency. There's tough moments, and there's tough moments in every season. I know what we have in him and was confident if anyone could right the ship, so to speak, it was him. Always interesting when that comes up, knowing over the first 8 weeks of the season, Green Bay ranked number 28 in time of possession per drive. Since then, the Packers ranked number 2 in time of possession per drive. So the offense doing everything it can to shield a defense that when they didn't have their full complement of players was gashed. The highlight or rock bottom, depending on how you look at it, giving up 34 points to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, so we'll get to a little bit later in the show. But Green Bay defensively against the run over the last couple weeks, Payne has been better, and they're going to need an all-hands-on-deck type performance against the top offense from an EPA perspective going back to Week 9, where we want to shower Jordan Love with praise, leading a number 2 offense. Well, San Francisco is better, and when you look at what Brock Purdy has done, his ability to facilitate and get the ball to his playmakers in space, the 49ers lead the league like they do every year in run after the catch. Christian McCaffrey wins the rushing title. We know Green Bay has been vulnerable to running back receptions, a variety of different ways that the mad scientist and Kyle Shanahan and company can attack with an extra week to prepare, even against the Green Bay defense that has shown better over the last couple weeks than they were for the lion's share of the season.
I think what's funny about this is we talk about players all the time being in a contract year. And all of the discussion was Joe Barry is likely to be relieved of his duties this offseason, but he's trying to save it the last couple weeks, and he's thrown in some unique wrinkles at the Bears that we mentioned, threw a couple wrinkles at the Cowboys last week. And then the unit is much healthier, as we've mentioned. And, they're playing their best ball of the season when it matters most. One of the wrinkles we saw last week from Joe Barry is the Packers had been extremely blitz happy this season. Chose not to blitz Dak, and that was a smart move. Shanahan said he started preparing for the Packers in the second quarter, and there hasn't been a ton of staff changes for Green Bay, so I think Kyle Shanahan pretty much has a straight shot in devising his game plan here. He's been able to see the wrinkles the last 2 weeks, and he'll have some counters built in for them, I would think, unless Joe Barry comes up with a third wrinkle in a third week. So I do think the question is how much success the 49ers have, because they're going to have success. I think you look at some of the Packers' improvements in health, and you equate for that. This is still just a massive class difference when you look at team versus team efficiency, but also a massive class difference in that the Packers have faced a schedule of offenses this season that's been bottom 10 in the NFL, and now you get the most efficient one who's well rested. This is still a Packers defense that can be run on, although what makes this interesting to me, the concepts are so familiar, and the Packers have been best defending the types of runs the 49ers employ, right? Outside zone. So that could be interesting as a potential outlier if you think about this game right after it ends late Saturday night and you're like, shit, how did the Packers cover this? They were able to, relatively speaking, do a better job stopping Christian McCaffrey in the 49ers ground game, and it allowed them to stay in a neutral state and keep Aaron Jones involved as long as humanly possible while the clock continued to tick. Like that's to me is like one of the paths where it's like that's the outlier. If you just look on the surface, you're like, the 49ers are going to be able to run the ball here. If they can't, it's because of that familiarity with being able to stop outside zone. I think the other thing that's, somewhat interesting here is, yes, Green Bay's been susceptible to the down-to-down runs. They haven't given up explosives. The 49ers ground game hasn't been as efficient down-to-down this season, but they've been explosive. And so that's another element here. The Green Bay is going to have to tackle better. They're the fourth worst in the NFL in yards allowed after first contact, so they can't give up. The 3-yard run has to be 3 and not 6. That's kind of the key to this. But, we saw last week when the Cowboys got in second and long situations, they tried running early. A lot of second down runs. The Cowboys ground game just isn't that efficient to get them back ahead of the down and distance to where you're in third and short, you're in third and manageable, depending on what part of the field you're in, right? It's you're using that second down run because it's going to be 4 down territory, and it was not an efficient manner to run the ball because that's been Dallas's Achilles heel. In terms of Brock Purdy in the throw game, I think that's what makes this one interesting, believe it or not. I think from the outside here, Todd, it's like everyone's like, the 49ers run the ball, the Packers don't really stop the run. Like, to me, I think the 49ers throw game is really interesting here. And it's very evident that Kyle trusts Brock. Like, regardless of what people think about Brock Purdy, like, it is plain as day. Shanahan is fully on board here. And you can just look, early down pass rates, depth of target on early down throws, all substantially higher with Brock than Jimmy G, okay? And Purdy has been very good against zone coverage. That's primarily what the Packers use. Usually, the Debo train gets fired up against defenses that play more zone coverage. I would expect my guy Jair Alexander to be out there. I would not really worry about some of the practice reports. Like, what he is. He doesn't need to practice. He can just show up on Sunday. But I don't think he's going to be 100%. And I think where this maybe gets interesting and this may surprise people is, like, despite having 5 defensive linemen with an average draft selection of 23rd, we mentioned last week, Joe Barry has been extremely blitz heavy. And so if you choose to not go the Dak route and you actually fire up the blitz, which is what the Packers have been doing, Brock Purdy, number 1 in success rate against the blitz, number 1 in yards per attempt against the blitz. I mean, he has been far and away the best quarterback in the NFL when blitzed. So the Packers have to try and get natural pressure, go with the non-blitz game plan they employed last week against Dak. What's interesting here is, like, despite all of the blitzes being sent, they're not generating a ton of pressures off them. 65% of the Packers' blitzes this season have not gotten home. It's the second highest rate in the league. And so, if you're forced to blitz here, I think that's where where Brock Purdy starts to shred up a little bit. I see too many advantages for the 49ers offense here. I think the key, if the Packers are going to have success on this side of the ball, aside from the obvious, right? Like we don't want to be, game day previews, turnovers, no shit. Right. I think it's maybe the Packers' ability just schematically being so familiar with outside zone runs because of the LaFleur-Shanahan incest, and they're better stopping outside zone runs than their general, run defensive metrics would suggest. So that's the first key. I think the second one is like that talented front that we keep referencing, they have to win. Right? I mean, think about the 49ers offensive line. It's Trent Williams and 4 pylons protected by a scheme. And that talent up front for the Packers has to show out here, because 3 or 4 of those guys just collectively, like man and man, mano a mano, have advantages against those other guys not named Trent Williams along that offensive line for the 49ers. So that's the way. Like, to me, the path is like the inverse. I think everyone's like, Jordan Love shredding here. It's like, no, I think it's like the Packers defense not being obliterated and keeping this in a neutral game state. So Aaron Jones is a factor and the clock keeps ticking. That's kind of the path for a cover from my perspective.
Oh, it makes a ton of sense, because if Green Bay gets themselves into too many known passing situations, it's exactly the way the 49ers defensive line is now built. With the acquisition of Chase Young, pin your ears back, come after the starting quarterback, and kind of do everything you can to wreak havoc and create some of those disruptive plays. Should be an interesting game to watch.
Reference your tweet from yesterday, by the way. I saw your tweet. I logged onto the old Twitter for the first time in like 48 hours. You mentioned since that acquisition of the trade, the pressure rate thing. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but
pressure rate when they have
that, sir.
So the 49ers have a 60% pressure rate when they have Nick Bosa, Chase Young, Javon Hargrave, and Eric Armstead all on the field this season. Now, it's not an extensive sample size because Armstead has missed the last 5 games, but that number dropped to 35% with any of them off the field since acquiring Chase from the Washington Commanders. So with those full complement of weapons there, it's clearly a much more formidable defensive front. And knowing that you had the bye week, knowing that they've rested Armstead and had that luxury dealing with that foot injury that I'm not sure will ever go away, because it seems like it's been recurring for him for the last couple of seasons, that this group can be as dynamic as any. And to your point, if the Packers find themselves in a negative game state, unable to commit to the ground game because they're chasing, pin your ears back, forget about it. This will be good night, sweetheart. And we'll see Jordan Love, who's done a phenomenal job protecting the football since week 9, potentially turn it over and create a short field or two for the 49ers. So many different interesting wrinkles. And as we wrap this game up, see the 51 cleared out of the market on that particular total, and see a couple of books going from 9.5 to 9. We'll see what the next move becomes from there. You can follow Payne on X at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, for all things Bet the Board related, you can follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. When we go to Sunday, Payne, the Bucs and the Lions will kick things off from Ford Field. Detroit, for the first time, I think ever, will get back-to-back home playoff games. A pair of former number 1 picks doing battle on divisional weekend, and it is probably, from a intrigue standpoint, maybe the least intriguing, although one of these teams will have a chance to get to the NFC Championship. They did play back in Week 6, a game where the Lions won 20-6 on the road at Tampa. It was the Bucs' worst offensive output of the season. Jared Goff threw for 300-plus yards, and Amon-Ra St. Brown went for 120-plus. Meanwhile, the Bucs seeking their 5th conference championship appearance in team history, most recently getting there under Tom Brady's leadership back in 2020. Tough to take much away, and not to discredit their performance from start to finish against the Eagles, but how much the Bucs deserve punch and pageantry for that versus the Eagles just pretty much laying down to close out their season. Meanwhile, for the Lions, they'll seek their first conference championship game appearance since the 1991 season, currently tied for the 2nd longest active drought. And they did have their first playoff win since 1991 last week with a 24-23 win against the Rams. I guess, Payne, when you look at a game like this, the best place to start with the Lions, a 6.5-point favorite, total of 48.5. Is the number a fair reflection of where these two teams are, knowing that people couldn't get enough enough of the Rams, and they were rewarded for their faith and hope in Matthew Stafford and Sean McVay, covering as a 3.5-point dog. And here comes a Tampa team seemingly disrespected by odds makers, but maybe not so much, knowing this number opened in that 5 range at one of the sharpest shops, 6 at others, and we've seen money come in on the favorite, pushing it out to 6.5.
Yeah. So again, going back to a point we made last week and then one at the top of the show, if you just go to your odds screen, you're going to see an opener of 6. That was not the true opener. It was a touch lower there if you were locked into your accounts. I think we can talk about this game a little bit differently than the last two. I think what's interesting about this is I went out of my way not to upgrade the Buccaneers, and for full disclosure, you can go back to listen to what we said last week, in that we had the Buccaneers power rated fractionally above an average team. I went on my way not to upgrade them this week, just for a reference point, even though, right, the Eagles quit. I still think the Buccaneers showed pretty well there. I went out of my way, and this is going to probably piss some people off, not to downgrade the Detroit Lions off of last week. And I am very happy for that organization. I'm very happy for that franchise. Very happy that Jared Goff was able to get over the hump there and beat his old team. My instinct is, when Jared Goff went to bed that night and laid his head on the pillow, he was like, holy shit, did I get away with one? Because as I watched that game, and McVay made a slew of errors, and this is his downfall. For an offensive mind, for a young guy, for a guy living on the West Coast, like, he might be the most conservative dude we have ever seen. I mean, he is willing to kick field goals down 7 late in games. He's throwing fade routes to Cooper Kupp when he gets in the red zone. And they could not score down there. And that was the reality of that game. And so,
but that had been something that had plagued the Rams all season. When the field condensed, they just couldn't find a way to be able to turn those long drives after moving it between the 20s into 7s, and it's cost us on a number of occasions with team totals.
For where I'm going with this is, the Buccaneers are certainly at their peak price. I still feel like the Lions are at their peak price. And so without making any of the adjustments last week, our number on this game is like 4.25. And so I think there's going to inherently be a battle here. We saw guys get out and lay the 4, the 5, the 5.5, the 6. We're at 6.5 now. There were a couple shops that said, hey, let's see what this feels like here at 7, and it just did not last. And so I think that's where you're going to have a little bit of the battle here. Which doesn't shock me for a game like this, but here's kind of where I'm going with this is, like, when I watched last week's game, and I'll use the tennis reference since you decided to talk about it this morning. To me, it felt like Sean McVay's game plan was, I'm going to just get this thing over the net, and eventually, I know my man Jared Goff's going to implode on himself. He's going to fall. He's going to have an error.
I feel like you're taking a jab at my tennis game. It's pusher tennis at its finest.
And he did it because he was right. He was right. I mean, look at what transpired after the script wore off.
They didn't do anything in the second half. Zip and pip.
They didn't do anything the final 2.5 quarters. They had one red zone trip at that point. I mean, I'm looking at this. This is just the second half. Detroit Lions, negative 0.32 EPA per play, 21% success rate. I mean, talking about this game, I think what's really interesting, right? Just we're already here on this side of the ball. It's like Raheem Morris loaded the box the final 2.5 quarters, put the game in Goff's hands, and Goff couldn't do it. And it's like, I know he beat him, and people are going to think McVay was wrong about his assessment, but that just wasn't the case. I also believe it wasn't fully on Goff. There hasn't been a larger proponent of Ben Johnson anywhere in the world. Maybe Ben Johnson's mother. Okay? Like, we have been on the Ben Johnson train before anybody knew he even existed. And so I didn't think this was his best work. Once the script wore off, Ben Johnson started going more run heavy on early downs, especially on first, and doing it from more predictable formations. And so the Rams literally stacked the box on 100% of third quarter runs. And despite like having a run advantage, when you tell the world what you're doing, defenses can stop the run, right? And so Goff apparently didn't have carte blanche to check out of any of those runs. Like, hey, boys, we're in heavy formation. They're loading the box every single time. There's 9 guys in the box, right? And this is partly why McVay got rid of him, right? Because you go back to like the Super Bowl against Belichick. The reason I would say not a great Patriots team was able to win that game is because Goff had to look over to the sideline every time and have Daddy tell him what to do. And McVay eventually got sick of that. And here you go in the second half. It's like he doesn't have carte blanche to check out of any of this stuff. I think what makes this interesting is the reason we might be a little bit higher on the Buccaneers, as we've been saying for probably 2 months now. We think their defense is a little bit better once they got healthy. And it's partly why we like the under Monday night. And, the full game got there. Unfortunately, the first half did not, right? I mean, a couple unfortunate happenings there probably didn't lead us to the window. But there was a large stretch where Tampa Bay is decimated in the secondary. They're decimated at linebacker. Vita Vea isn't playing. So
you saw the impact of the rookie out of Pittsburgh, Cansey, he made when he was out there, who missed extended time early in the year with the calf injury.
So I went back and looked, and the sample size isn't large. It's 115 snaps. But if you look when the core 8 defenders of the Bucs played, and I'm going to try, I probably should have wrote those down. Cansey, Vita Vea, Shaq Barrett, the 2 linebackers, Dean, Winfield, and Carlton Davis. I think that's 8 by my monkey math here. I'm counting on my fingers.
I'm counting on my fingers. I think that was 8. A good job for you not writing it down. I think that was good. Well
they
done.
Have been elite versus the run. More than 2 times better against the run in EPA than the Browns when that core 8 is on the field at the same time. And so right off the bat, you're thinking this game probably is going to be in the hands of Goff again. And so what is Ben Johnson going to do? Is Jared Goff going to be able to check out of these things? You're going to need a more aggressive game plan from Ben Johnson. Again, I go back and you look, in that first quarter, the Lions were bypassing every third down. Didn't see a third down in the first quarter. Second half, average distance to go on third down was 9.8 yards. So I would think the Bucs are able to stop the run here. What you need to do against the Bucs is they are inherently going to dial up pressure. I mean, it's just what Todd Bowles does. And in the first matchup in Tampa, the offensive line for Detroit did a great job not allowing the blitzes to get home. And you fire up that play action because the Buccaneers defense is wildly susceptible to play action passes. But if you don't get home, you got to make these blitzing teams pay. We do have a situation where the Lions play in a division of Brian Flores, right, who's super blitz happy. And the Lions found success in those matchups against a blitz happy team. And so there is some precedent there. If you're willing to put this game in Goff's hands, and he's willing to be a little bit more aggressive, and he's willing to check out of these heavy box looks, there's going to be some opportunities, I think, for Detroit's offense to be explosive if they're doing that, Todd.
When you look at Detroit defensively, we've seen their vulnerability on full display to teams that actually say, the hell with it, we're going to go out there, we're going to chuck it, and make you show that you can slow us down. Detroit did not exactly perform real well in that scenario last week. I think Puka Nacua is still running untouched against Cam Sutton on a double move. We saw Dave Canales come up with an aggressive game plan, and credit to the Bucs. They played on their front foot. He had Baker Mayfield spread the ball around, and you had players like David Moore and Trey Palmer get in on the fun with big explosive passing plays. The Bucs offensively, a path to success here. We know Detroit can stop the run. It may take Rachaad White's ability to run the football between the tackles out of the mix, but if Baker's able to hit some of those throws, I have to imagine Tampa is able to have some success and maybe play on their front foot for the second time in as many weeks in climate-controlled conditions.
That's it. You said it. That's the entire matchup on this side of the ball. We saw Dave Canales come out, had one of his best and most aggressive game plans of the season against Philly. Helen Keller knew that was the attack plan, right? Everyone saw it. And so I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball this week. We've talked about their inability as a team to run the ball efficiently. We know the Lions just stomp out the run game. And the difference is, you're now facing a defense and a noisy dome. The complete opposite of the Philadelphia Eagles, right? These aren't quitters. These are tryhards, right? That's what Detroit's built themselves on. So you can't waste runs. And Dave Canales did a better job not wasting runs last week. You mentioned that first matchup. Dave Canales identified it. We got to attack the Lions secondary. 49% of Baker's throws in that first meeting traveled 10-plus yards. Unfortunately, he was 7 for 8 on those throws. 2 for 10 on throws 20-plus yards. So I think Canales puts the game in Baker's hands to attack the Lions secondary. One thing I think maybe we were a touch off about, that 8 days certainly gave Baker some time to rest. The ankle looked a little bit better. He was running early. The rib situation didn't seem to bug him. Really, the worst thing was when his offensive lineman stepped on his non-injured ankle and he was hobbling around for a little bit, but he looked much healthier. This obviously is a short week, but I think the game is in Baker's hands, and it didn't go well the first time around. That's it. They're not going to be able to run the ball here. So this is the Baker Mayfield show. And so I understand, potentially thinking, I don't want to, we pulled the string last week, +3. I don't know if I want to go back to that well in this spot. And I think that's been kind of the thought process from a lot of professional bettors until it gets to 7 where they see potential value there. And then the other faction is, got out ahead and laid the Lions. But if Baker Mayfield and those wide receivers aren't on the same page, right? I mean, Mike Evans with a couple big drops. It was good to see the other wide receivers with like Moore get involved. Kate Otten had 3 drops. I know he wasn't credited with 3, had 3.
Dude was a horse in the middle of the field.
Right.
He could have had about 13 catches in that spot.
Yeah, that was not a defended play. I mean, that was a drop for a touchdown. There was a drop through the seam. I mean, he had multiple drops. So Kate Otten, a guy, right, that we've talked about, you want to be able to attack the Lions linebackers. So Kate Otten probably has a decent spot here to show out. I think for me, as I look at this, like, I'll just be candid. As everyone knows, like, I didn't really love last weekend's matchups. I don't really love this weekend's matchups. It's unfortunate as you kind of zoom out and put it in the right context. We had 6 games last week, right, Todd? My math serves me.
Yep, 6 is correct.
And then we've got 7 left. So the entire playoffs in totality, was it 13 games?
7 plus
right?
6, the math checks. 7 plus 6 is 13.
Didn't even need my fingers for that one. So
well, if you had 13 fingers, we may have to have other discussions.
What's that lady from that old movie that had the third breast? Was that Total Recall?
Yeah,
but
I have no idea how that's 13 fingers and how that all ties together.
Yeah. Anyways, so my point here is like this is less potential opportunities than just like a normal non-buy slate, so to speak, for a regular week. So it's like, when you put it in that context, like you're not going to have plays on every single game here. My favorite thing that we've done this week so far actually came in this game. We went under 16.5 rush attempts for Rachaad White. I simply don't think the game state, the style of play is, the matchup is going to lend itself to Rachaad White as a runner in this game. I think his most efficient path is certainly as a pass catcher. So that of all the things this weekend and specific to this game, that was my favorite bet. Still see some value there. I think at 15.5, ours was a little bit lower if you look at what and how Tampa's used him in games where they have trailed, and certainly the thought process going into this is they would be trailing based upon the spread.
Should be an interesting game. We'll see what team can run it back. You do wonder a little bit about the Lions and a potential letdown given all the emotion that went into that game.
You, that's good. What's your thought process on that? Because I know you look at this stuff more than me. If this was a regular season week and
we're playing against the Lions.
Yeah.
100% in that spot, because I don't think, and I know they're saying the right things, the ticket cost is through the roof there. I just can't see the energy being the exact same for a 3 o'clock Eastern kickoff in that game, not having Matthew Stafford back in the building, seeing the emotion from the fans just in the wake of that performance there. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have Antoine Winfield saying, we're on a revenge tour. We want to go back and beat the teams that beat us early in the year. They checked the first box with the Philadelphia Eagles. The Lions could potentially be the second box, and if they were to meet the 49ers, should they win outright as an underdog, that would be the third box in a game that they were manhandled. I just think Tampa is a team whose upward trajectory...
Well, get me a Bucs 49ers matchup, and
there's a
that
distinct...
might be my favorite bet.
There's a possibility, but look, we were hoping that we had a Lions-Eagles matchup is what we were hoping for this week with some of the market numbers that were floating out there, with Detroit a modest 3-point favorite in that particular game. Don't think that number would have lasted. Don't think that number would have lasted, but here we are with a game at 6.5. We'll see where the next move goes, and if it gives you an opportunity to back the dog plus the 7. Into the final game of the weekend, Payne, and you mentioned a watered-down version of what we've seen in previous installations for these two teams that have been the hallmark, the gold standard, and more or less the precedent and trendsetters in the AFC in recent iterations. It's the Bills, 2.5-point home underdogs. We are changing venues for this year's matchup. Total on the game, 45.5. There were some threes early on. Those numbers were cleared out pretty quickly. And Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen are the first opposing quarterbacks in NFL history with 3+ playoff matchups against one another at age 28 or younger. The second time since 1970. Quarterbacks from different divisions will have met 7 times in a 4-year span, rivaling what Tom Brady and Peyton Manning did as members of the Patriots and Colts from 2003 to 2006. And when we look at these two franchises, they are the two winningest AFC sides since 2020. Before we get into some of the X's and O's, and I'll let you highlight some of the matchups that you want to watch, I think the first question I have to ask is about the rest advantage in the case of the Chiefs or disadvantage for Buffalo. We know that the Bills had their game moved from Sunday to Monday because of unfortunate weather situations. Is there anything you can do to try and quantify this, or you just factor that into the back of your handicap and going, I made my number X, but I have to downgrade my number slightly, knowing that Kansas City should come in as the fresher of the two teams?
This might go opposite. You're setting me up here because this is going to go opposite of what my maybe belief system is on this game and where the information is coming in. But like my number here on a neutral is Bills minus 1.5. So at like 2.75 in a really good home field advantage, in theory, this line is short.
Yep.
However, yes, this matters. And I know you tried digging up the data there, and there isn't a large enough sample size specific to the playoffs. But one thing we've been touching on the last few years is late season rest. And so it's not just the idea of this week, but also the Chiefs effectively took a Week 18 bye as well. So it has a compounding effect where they took off Week 18. The Bills are traveling to Miami, playing in humidity, battling back for a division title, and then are on a short week now.
Well, and we can go one step further on that. The Bills have essentially been battling for their playoff lives for 5 weeks, and it includes another cross-country trip on a short week to Los Angeles that got factored in there as well.
Yep. And so I wouldn't say it's necessarily fully being priced in, but that in conjunction with some question marks about the Bills' defensive injuries is why we're... Now, listen, you can shop around, right? There's some 320. I told you yesterday there was some properties that are dealing, 315 on the Chiefs, and those were the initial nibbles. Anytime this has gotten to 3, there's been pro money on the Chiefs. I think from a price perspective, as the days gradually go on, and the potential for Bills players defensively to trickle into practice, this line may leak closer to 3, and then you get the Sunday night game, and the public's obviously going to be on Josh Allen because they've been riding that train for 5, 6, 7 weeks now in the futures market and virtually every market. So I would expect that to continue as well.
All right, well, let's start right there then. I mean, if we're talking about the Bills' defense, and we can go through the mash unit of the group that wasn't able to finish last week. I mean, injuries starting to become a concern. The Bills had 7 notable defenders who played in Week 18 that either didn't play in the wildcard game or left with injury. Tyrell Dodson, DMP versus the Steelers. Rasul Douglas, DMP, says he's going to be out there on Sunday. No reason not to believe him. Taylor Rapp didn't play against the Steelers. He was a DMP in practice on Wednesday. Terrell Bernard left the game versus the Steelers, missed practice on Wednesday. He has a team-high 143 tackles this season, 43 more tackles than the next closest player, which is Jordan Poyer. Balin Spector, a depth piece at linebacker, left the game versus the Steelers, DNP on Wednesday. Taron Johnson left the game versus the Steelers, limited on Wednesday, in concussion protocol, but suffered his second concussion of the season. I know concussions don't really count the same in the playoffs and when the games mean a little bit more than they do in September and October, but still something that has to factor in. And then Christian Benford left the game versus the Steelers. He was out on Wednesday. Here's a Chiefs offense, Payne, that clearly hasn't been fixed by any stretch of the imagination. But the one thing we saw last week from Matt Nagy and Andy Reid, they went, fuck it. We're going to focus on 3 players that we trust to make plays. Isaiah Pacheco, Travis Kelce, and Rashee Rice represented 70% of the offensive touches. They kept largely the same personnel groupings out there. Didn't need a dynamic offensive performance against a beleaguered Dolphins defense, but at least looked to be somewhat more capable than what we've seen down the stretch. Always tough to try and figure out if Kansas City has taken a step forward or this will be more about the Bills being that banged up on the defensive side.
Yeah, I think there really isn't anything earth-shattering in this matchup, right? It's going to truly come down to who executes better because, again, there are no mysteries here. This is the 7th matchup in 4 years. These teams know each other like the back of their hands. Certainly, to your point, the conversation starts with some of the injuries, and we mentioned, the impact that'll have on where this line trends. I do think the idea of the Bills being decimated defensively is a bit overblown.
It's not quite as bad as the Dolphins. I will say that for sure.
Now, could there be re-injury because someone isn't 100%? Sure. Now, if we all had crystal balls and new guys would get re-injured or injured before games actually started, right, this betting thing might be a little bit easier. But I
don't even need to know that, Payne. I just need to know who's going to win the turnover battle. That's all I ask from the crystal ball, and then I'm fine.
I think of all the guys you mentioned, Christian Benford and Terrell Bernard are the 2 most impactful guys for Buffalo's defense that have the largest chance of missing this game. Rasul Douglas returned to practice. He's been very impactful in the Bills' 180 change defensively. He was that affordable trade guy they brought in. He was just a perfect scheme fit. And Douglas claims he could have played last week against Pittsburgh, so I fully expect him out there. Terrell Dodson practiced a bit on Wednesday. He's vital to the Bills linebacker room, highest graded player on the entire defense. Taron Johnson, the Bills slot corner, is in the concussion protocol. Listen, it's that time of the year is what I will say. We all watched a player get concussed last week and he was ready for the next drive. Right. So, I mean,
I don't know what player you're talking about.
Guy's just tough as nails. That's just why I really respect that guy. He just does not matter. He's going to be fucking slinging 100-mile-an-hour fastballs, taking headshots from his
him
casket.
And his wife. Talk about coming from good stock for the 2 fighters that they have there. Good Lord.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're looking at this. It's Douglas, Dodson, Taron Johnson, Bedford, and Bernard are the key 5 to keep an eye on. I know you mentioned Taylor Rapp. That was nice of you. More of a 0 than a hero.
Look, Payne, we're equal opportunity around these parts.
Spector, obviously, in a backup role, he showed decently well there. But if Dotson is there, and I think maybe in a game like this, I know Klein was effectively removed from his yacht vacation to rejoin the team. But I think maybe a spot this large, you go with, McDermott goes with the hand he knows best there, and Klein. But those 5 I just rattled off there, those are the impact guys. So focus on those. In terms of the matchup, I think if you get a worst case scenario for the Bills defense in terms of injuries, I would expect Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes to dial up as much pre-snap motion as humanly possible, get those linebackers in conflict. If the Chiefs don't do it often enough, hopefully they do it a little bit more. I know they've been advised of such, but dial up more play action. the Bills defense becomes a shell of itself when teams throw with play action, and a lot of that is to do with, guys in and out of that back half. Where this game ultimately is decided, and probably where you land on this as a bettor and maybe how you interpret, I think is, as I think about this, right, and you kind of hinted at the top there is the Chiefs offense. Like, how do you interpret what's gone on here, the last couple of weeks? It's really been like a hot topic all season. Right? I mean, the last two games where Mahomes started were against Cincinnati and Miami. Like, how much credit are you giving them for looking competent on the surface? I mean, I get it. 25 points, 26 points, despite going 3 for 9 in the red zone in those games. It sounds fantastic. If you get the red zone offense humming, suddenly, could have hung 35. Well, the Bengals defense finished the season bottom 10 in schedule adjusted efficiency. And in that game, if you remove non-garbage time, the Chiefs' success rate was 39%. They finished that Week 17 game against the Bengals 17th in EPA per play. Wild card weekend. Get a decimated Dolphins defense without 6 starters playing on a short week in frigid temperatures. That defense also had compared to the Eagles, not much quit. But there's a couple guys out there not wanting to tackle in that weather. But I guess my point is,
it's cold. It's cold. I'm not going to fault them. It's cold out there.
Yeah, I mean, Riley's out there just going. Might have put him in red with a little towel there, and full-blown matador in a couple of those. 12 teams obviously played in the wild card round. The Chiefs offense finished 8th in success rate, 6th in EPA per play, went 2 for 6 in the red zone, just against a decimated Dolphins defense. So, yes, there have been some changes offensively. You mentioned going to the core guys there last week. That's been a point of emphasis. Let's just start spamming Kelsey and Rice and Pacheco. And the other thing that's also interesting here is Mahomes and Reed have likely had a one-on-one discussion. Their actions are effectively saying the quiet part out loud, and neither of them fully trust Matt Nagy at this point. So you've seen Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs offense get to the line of scrimmage substantially quicker. Mahomes is sticking with the call, or he's making the change, and he's certainly doing the latter far more frequently than what's being sent in by Matt Nagy. And so the Chiefs are snapping the ball a little bit quicker in recent weeks. You go back to that first matchup, the Chiefs were without their starting left tackle and Pacheco against the Bills. Would be smart if the Bills linebackers aren't fully healthy, just get that screen game going. Should see lots of short passes from Mahomes. I know Jerick McKinnon will be missed in a game like this unless CEH fills that role efficiently as a pass catcher. Again, more play action. Mahomes uses that a 16% season-long rate. I think when you're thinking about, intermediate and deep shots, it's got to come off play action. So again, for me, this is just execution, right? The teams are so familiar with each other. If this was a few years back, you'd probably think Pacheco could get going a little bit more on the ground with the, running through the interior of that great Chiefs offensive line. They just haven't gotten as much push up front this season, and then Daquan Jones returned for the Bills, and so it's how efficient are the Chiefs going to be running? And I just don't think that efficient. So this is very much going to be, Pacheco hopefully extending drives and short yardage, being efficient there. CH and Pacheco being efficient as pass catchers. Rashee Rice doesn't look like a bone bruise on his left knee that we kind of thought would be the case there after that fall on the frozen ice there, basically late in that Dolphins game. And then it's on Mahomes. He's gonna have to be a magician. It's going to be a lot of quick, short passes. This game's on Mahomes. I don't get the vibe this is going to look like. To me, it looks more like the last matchup than other playoff matchups we've had here.
And you mentioned the last matchup. It was dominated by the defense. Buffalo got out quickly and more or less bogged down for the better part of the second half. The numbers that Josh Allen and company put forth, nothing to write home about. And you can understand against the Kansas City defense that ranks second in points per game allowed, yards per game allowed, and sacks. They kept teams from scoring touchdowns on 50% of their red zone trips, a mark that was good enough for top 10 in the league, and allowed a league-low 46 plays of 20 or more yards. So they've been great at suppressing some of the explosives. We know the Chiefs are slightly vulnerable against the run. It's been their Achilles heel for years. Buffalo making a renewed commitment to running the football since Joe Brady took over, getting James Cook involved. But it's a young defense. It's a group that has a ceiling significantly higher than what we've seen in the past. We've seen the disruptive force that Chris Jones can be on one side, George Karlaftis coming of age in his sophomore season, Charles Omenihu providing a nice complement, and the interior of that defensive line as well. In steps a Bills offense that I know it checks all the boxes in terms of star power and all of the buzz. With Josh Allen, we've seen the highlight reel runs. The ground game has been working. Stephon Diggs, high volume of catches the last 2 weeks, even if the yards haven't been there. Dalton Kincaid, Dawson Knox, the list goes on and on. But when you look at this side of the ball, Payne, do you give an edge to either the Bills' offensive attack or what we've seen from Kansas City defensively, kind of being the one common denominator getting to the Chiefs to this point in the season?
As we record, someone impactful must have had a hankering for a hot dog, because they just went to 3 flat there.
They refuse to use juice on their number, so I may or may not have to pick off a crumb at 3 flat there.
There you go. So again,
may
like,
not
to
be
me,
the right side, but I'll have a good number in my pocket.
This is pretty straightforward. I think the Bills lean on the ground game. You just think about their makeup: 3rd in adjusted line yards created, 7th in run block win rate. So you're going to fire up James Cook in this game. That's clearly the Bills' best edge offensively against a bottom 10 Chiefs run defense, but specifically the style of runs too kind of bode well for the Bills' offense. They're very much a hat-on-hat power and man concepts. Bills lead the league in percentage of power rush concepts by a mile. Kansas City, 7th worst in EPA per rush allowed to power runs, 4th worst against man concepts. Everything else, though, gets a bit tricky for the Bills' offense. I think we've smartly coined the word clunky when talking about the Bills' offense all season, because you can't say it's bad. It's top 5 offense, but it goes in weird spurts, right? Like the script was awesome, and then like the game sealing touchdown, awesome. Everything else was utter dog shit.
I did like the
Bills' offense last week against Pittsburgh.
I did like the fake slide from Josh Allen. He should have tipped his cap to Kenny Pickett, who perfected that move.
You can't say fake slide. The mafia is going to be out in full force in your mentions, sir. It was a stutter step. It was a stutter step. It was a Barry Sanders stutter step.
Barry Sanders. I like that unique spin you're placing on it there. Come to a complete stop on an NFL football field.
And then if you get the right angle. The Bills fans were like, they're sending, dick pics on Snapchat. They were like, from this angle, it looks really good. He was not trying to slide. I don't know what goes on sometimes with that fan base. I just try to keep my distance there.
Western New York is a different place. You got some family up there. You know what it's like. Aside
from Billy, that's the one guy who we allow into the fold.
Well, that's because he's a bettor first and foremost.
Yes, that is why. It's certainly not because he's a Bills fan. I think, kind of putting this thing back on the rail. Somehow we are going to go an hour and a half on 4 games. I'm interested to see what other pitches Buffalo has. You mentioned Josh Allen's legs. They're likely a factor. If you look, though, because of the familiarity that I've mentioned, right, this again being the 7th matchup in 4 seasons, the Chiefs have progressively gotten better. The last 2 matchups, whether it is impromptu or designed run, Josh Allen's averaging 4.3 a carry. I mean, he ran wild in 2020, but, Spags is like gradually cooked up enough to not get drilled in that area, and the linebacker room got younger and more athletic with Bolton and Gay, and then you go add Tranquil, and it's like, it's become a really good unit. And then you go back and watch that game. The first matchup this week, I know you and I were traveling. We caught the end of it. But watching on the replay, then all of a sudden you dig into like the data and you're seeing all of the coverage concepts. I mean, Spags threw the kitchen sink at Josh Allen and Joe Brady last time. It was like a buffet of coverages. Rarely the same thing. Josh Allen and Joe Brady did not handle it overly well, and they had 2 weeks to prepare. Remember, right, the Bills were off the bye. The Chiefs were on a short week, having played the Sunday night football game against Green Bay. Bills had 2 red zone trips that entire game. I think Snead travels with Diggs. We know Snead loves to be physical at the line of scrimmage, and he'll hold a little bit. Sean Hockley is the lead ref in this game. He's well below average in calling that particular type of penalty. We saw Snead. He's in a contract year. Just did a very, very good job on Tyreek Hill aside from one play. The Chiefs are also 3rd and yards per target to the tight end position. We know the Chiefs made an effort, again, to upgrade that linebacker room. Very good. McDuffie has been absolute nails. He's likely going to remove Shakir in the slot from this game. And, I think about this, and he never came around, right? But he was the perfect complement to Diggs in these games. Gabe Davis has been that guy who's really successful against Kansas City. It's because he's an afterthought, right? You have to focus on Josh Allen's legs. You got to focus on him as a passer. You got to focus on Diggs. Like there's not enough dudes to go around. So it's like Gabe Davis was, incessantly seeing the backside one-on-one matchups, and he would dominate this. I don't think he goes. And if he does, to me, that might be like one of the more impactful guys injured. I know we're all talking about the defensive injuries, and I don't think Gabe Davis is like some elite player. But for this matchup, I think he's missed. And so, you just go back and look last time. And again, I know the Bills got the win, but it's like Josh Allen was completing like 50% of his passes. Diggs and Kincaid went for like 45 combined yards. You had 2 weeks to prepare for that. Now you're on the short week. So it's like, I don't know how much offensive success Buffalo has here. And I think if you're making a case for the Chiefs, this is the side of the ball that you're likely thinking shows extremely well. So
should be an interesting way to close things off for a divisional weekend that lacks a little bit of the intrigue in terms of some of the numbers on Saturday, but does not lack storylines this time of year, as by this time next week, we'll go from 8 down to 4, have a pair of championship games, and we'll have a much better indication of teams that are vying for their place at the table and a chance to play for the Lombardi Trophy in Las Vegas. You can follow Payne on X at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And I know we talked a little bit about this before the show. Markets ultra efficient this week. We've kind of tipped our hand in a lot of the things that we're looking for, but a lot of numbers just not where we need them to be just yet to necessarily get us to the window, Payne.
Yeah, I think if I was going down this board, right, not to bury the lead, nothing official. But if I was just going down this board, we're going to be keeping an eye on on the first game, Saturday. Wind. What does that look like? If there's no wind there, probably feel a little sorry for the guys who are taking the second and third number on that under. I don't necessarily want to give out 7-point teasers on this podcast. Like, for guys who are doing this professionally, right? You're probably still dealing in a world where you can get minus 130, or you have access to shops on the legal side that are dealing 40, right? And so, like, I'd be very intrigued by a Ravens to 49ers kind of fading the elite young quarterback play of last week. Now, where do those prices go? Maybe you can get better, right? Suddenly, if you have a situation where, those, we're seeing dog money because the public has their say and they're infatuated with what they saw last. And one of those games were to get down to like a 6-point teaser corridor. Now all of a sudden, like, you're implementing the Chiefs there if they don't get to 3. But you're kind of playing that game as like you don't want to use a 6-pointer if you can get 3, and there are places you can get 3 now. So, from a teaser perspective, like if you told me right now, like, hey, like, you can get 7 minus 30 at your local out, or you have access to 7 minus 40 forward facing, like, it's pretty interesting getting the Ravens down to 2.5 and the 49ers down to 2. But, again, for something official, I don't really want to give out something that's necessarily minus 140 there, although there have been instances where, money line for us has come prevalent there. Bucks Lions, again, I think my favorite bet, although you can't get a ton down on this, but we've slowly leaked money into that market is under 16.5 rush attempts for Rashad White. Then we just broke this game down here Bills Chiefs. I think the professional side here is going to be the Chiefs at 3, and every time it's been there, it's gotten taken out, and I think there's probably a decent chance, if some of those Bills defensive players start to get upgraded a little bit, that you could have a slow leak in conjunction with the public going to be on the Bills here in that standalone Sunday night game. So those are kind of my thoughts. Again, I don't have any full positions here, side or total, to give out. And I think the good thing about, when you own your own show. And we do things a little bit differently, and we're creating content as
professional bettors and not content to create content for views. You can go this path. Not every single podcast is going to have a hammer or a lock or a best bet. And so just, how this is shaping up this weekend and the ability to be a little bit more judicious.
That, but like we're just kind of waiting on some
pragmatic, patient.
If you told me, we were dealing 8.5 here on one of those games, right? Like, I'm okay firing up a 6-point teaser. I just, I don't want to give out a 7-point teaser. But personally speaking, I will probably have one at some point. So that's just kind of my thoughts here on this. And again, like, don't beg, don't ask, don't email, don't shoot notes in a mention, or like, if there is something that like suddenly changes and we absolutely love it, we'll throw it up on the website, and there might be a 10% chance of that. So like, I wouldn't expect it, but if that were to arise, periodically check the website.
Things are fluid in this market. We'll see where the numbers go. We'll see how
Markets
Mother Nature
are fluid.
We'll see how Mother Nature decides she wants to impact games this weekend, or in some cases, maybe not impact them, and we will go from there. So thanks, as always, for folks that have tuned in from start to finish. 90 minutes, unprecedented deep dives for just 4 games on the docket this weekend, trying to cover all of the offensive versus defensive matchups, a look behind the curtain at some of the player props that have caught our eye, and more importantly, taken a portion of our bankroll this weekend, and a number of different ways to try and attack things overall. Anything else that you'd like to get off your chest, my friend? Final parting shots.
No, that's it. All
right.
That sounded like I had a bone to pick with somebody. I did.
I mean, normally it's with me.
Ball.
Normally it's with me. So, I mean, I understand it. It's warranted more often than not. So we go from there. But no, I think everything you said definitely resonates. Look, we're not going to force things that we haven't invested in ourselves. And a weekend like this where the market is ultra efficient often creates some challenges and maybe not as many opportunities as we're looking for, or our listeners are as well. So best of luck to all of the Bet the Board folks out there with whatever you choose to play this coming weekend. And hopefully we'll see you at the Whitney.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.